All right. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for taking the time to join our webinar with Keyless and Auth0 about unlocking a frictionless future with passwordless biometric authentication. I'm Tobias. I'm a solutions engineer at Auth0, focusing on building a great platform for your application identity needs. And I'm very honored to be joined by Fabian today, co-founder of Keyless. Fabian, could you please say a few words about yourself?
Thanks very much, Tobias. I'm Fabian, COO and co-founder of Keyless. We're an Auth0 and Okta partner, and we provide frictionless authentication and payments experiences without compromising on security and privacy compliance.
Thank you very much. And this is exactly what you can expect from this webinar to learn today. It's about how can we take that next step? How can we make sure that our users, no matter what they're doing in our application, are secure, do not have to sacrifice their privacy, and do not have to sacrifice the user experience. So how can we shift to a reliable biometric passwordless login, for example? But also in the concept, how can we shift to better ways of supporting our users navigating our app than the traditional email and password that they might used to use. So this is what this webinar is about. Stick with us, and then in the end, we also have a Q&A section. So if you have any questions there, feel free to just put them in the chat, and we will make sure to go back to them later. But before we dive into how to make the best identity experience out there, let's take a few moments to talk about what is identity in the first place. And when you think about this little login box you see on every website you're interacting with nowadays, we basically have two functions. It's both a front door that you can lock, that you can unlock, where you can put additional checks in place, but also a reception. It's a welcome area. It's the first spot that any of your users will interact with when they start interacting with your application. Because all an identity provider does in the end is it's connecting users to your app. It's making sure that your application knows who is my user and how can I help them better. So it's not only about keeping them out or keeping the wrong people out. It's also about making sure that the legit user can easily access your application and can easily get into your app. And with that comes, let's say, 4 key areas for a user management system. A, who is the user? So what are they doing? Is this really the user who wants to sign in? So that's the security aspect of it. How sure am I that they are the ones who are signing in? And how does that translate into what the user is allowed to do in my application? So this is a security aspect. Who are they? Authentication. What are they allowed to do? Authorization. And then we can flip that story. How can our application support that user? What could we learn about them? Is it easy enough for them to access our application? These are all the reception questions, the user experience questions that we should ask to make sure users are not only secure and verified when they access the app, but also making sure that we can increase the value we provide to users, or at least not decrease the value by putting unnecessary checks and policies in place for those users. And speaking of user experience, this is something that is vital in every single application that you're building. So whenever we talk about CIAM, consumer identity and access management, the consumer is the one who needs to figure out how to operate your application. And you can build the best app in the world. If your users don't get over that initial step of signing up for your solution, accessing your solution, then you will lose out on users and you will lose out on value that you could have. Because even if we're looking at public sector institutions, financial institutions, where privacy and security is a key, where we absolutely have to make sure those two are always given when we handle sensitive data, we still have alternatives. The alternative for a financial institute might be a competitor, but even the substitute for a public sector app is I'm just going physically somewhere, which means for me as an institution, I have to pay a building, I have to pay people, I have to sacrifice a lot of efficiency in my processes. So no matter what company, what scenario we're dealing with, user experience is always key for any user interaction with an identity system. And this is not just us speaking because we happen to tell you how to do a better user experience. This is actually something that we see in our statistics and that we see in our numbers with our customers every single day. So when we see that just a sign-in with Google and Facebook can improve conversion rates by 10 to 50%, that means 50% more users that you get just by signing in, by having a sign-in with Google. Every third user signs up only because they don't have to register a new password with you. So this is a huge value you can unlock. But also in B2B scenarios, many businesses require strong customer authentication and they require single sign-on. Some companies just won't do business with you if it means all of their users have to create a new account with your solution. They expect that users can easily single sign into your solution, that the IT admin of your customer still keeps control over the user's data. So it's not only about unlocking potential, it's also about blocking potential, blocking sales, because you don't have that experience for your users. And when we think about what we have to do to build that great experience, and this is also where Okta and Auth0 comes in as a platform, we have this threefold process. First of all is identity verification, checking who's interacting with my system. And this is what we call assurance. This is what this webinar will be about. How can we make sure that we keep up assurance and then we can make sure we're sure who that user is who's accessing our application. But then afterwards, and this is something you have to put in context, you have to translate that into access control, teaching your application what can this user do now that I absolutely know who they are, which is control. And last but not least, how does that help me getting better services in, just integration. And this is where Auth0 and Okta can help you as a platform, having that full user journey. And this is also where we are very, very happy to partner with Keyless to get in that first bucket, the assurance button, this best possible experience for you, we're secure and user experience friendly, to make sure we even get a chance to think about all those security controls and interpretation of our app that come afterwards. So let's dive a lot deeper into the assurance part, and I would hand over to Fabian, our expert, our chief expert in this call, to talk us through how Keyless approaches this problem.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tobias, for that insightful introduction. And yeah, delighted to continue that conversation and introduce Keyless and talk about the authentication aspect within identity in making sure the user is actually who they say they are. With Keyless, we provide this frictionless authentication and payments experience across or for all users without compromising on security and compliance. And we're doing so by providing seamless multi-factor authentication with just one look in the camera of any device, but doing so without storing biometric data anywhere, not on the user's device, but also in no central database. And when we look at the challenges that Tobias described with the user experience, convenience, and privacy security that translate into the aspects within authentication exactly the same, where we have friction, so the user experience aspect, which is often balanced by addressing fraud in the context of security, particularly account takeovers, in ensuring that the user accounts are protected. Then there's cost, typically going back to password related issues, whether that's in the call center. A simple reset for one password in the enterprise can cost up to $70 according to Forrester. So that's a big cost driver. And then there's the underlying compliance and regulatory aspects with the GDPR in Europe, for example, the strong customer authentication requirements under the Open Banking Directive or PSD2 that mandate multi-factor authentication, which adds in another complexity to striking the right balance in that trade-off. And when we look at the challenges that we observe in the market, is that we see account takeover fraud or identity theft skyrocket, and particularly over the last few years. The number of fraudulent logins has almost tripled over the last year. The cost for identity stemming from identity theft and related aspects is increasing steadily, and the overall share of identity-related fraud as a fraction of total fraud that is observed in the market is at more than 75%. And what we typically see, and what you may also be familiar from your own experiences, is that that fraud or that security aspect is addressed by adding additional friction, adding friction with another step for multi-factor authentication, yet another PIN code you may need to copy and paste, or a password you need to remember, which is compromising that user experience aspect that Tobias described as well, and ultimately translates into user churn, which is detrimental to any business. And we're seeing this across the entire user journey, from the initial first step at account login, where we have about 40% of abandonment when users face a complex login box, don't remember the password, and just don't even bother to continuing. When you're within the journey at the very end, we're realizing yet another 30% of users, in this case in the e-commerce sector, quit the checkout process because the checkout is too cumbersome. There's another multi-factor authentication step. If we want to make a payment, we have to approve that by multi-factor authentication, and that is another user experience aspect that needs to be addressed. And when we look at the younger population, about 50%, so 1 out of 2 people leave the site altogether because they forget their passwords and don't even bother to start a reset process because it's just too complex. And if this isn't enough, there's also a regulatory hurdle that many businesses need to comply with, which mandates multi-factor authentication to protect the users against these very frauds and security aspects that we've described. This is typically a combination out of 2 out of 3 factors: an inherence factor, something you are, like your fingerprint or your face, something you have, a device you own, a hard token, and something you know, like a password or PIN. And we at Keyless, we believe this trade-off, or that balance around security, fraud protection, and regulatory compliance shouldn't compromise on the user experience, particularly the user experience around authentication. And something that we typically see is that authentication is equates to account login, which is very true, but by far this isn't just the only use case where authentication is involved. The initial step, whether that's logging into an app on our mobile devices or on a website or desktop, is familiar to everyone. The login box, as you know, and facilitating that in a passwordless fashion with just one look in the camera of the device we're using is something that we help with. The additional, on the next use case, is around step-up authentication. So multi-factor authentication only in cases where you need to know that the user is actually the user, and you have a risk or you see a risk that that user may not be the same individual. For example, because of changing locations or making a very high payment or a high risk operation, like changing a setting that is important to that user account, where you want to make sure that that aspect of that operation is really conducted by the user who owns that account, and hence, step up or provide the strong authentication for that very specific operation. The additional aspect, and this more geared toward the financial services or the e-commerce sector, where we see strong customer authentication requirements. So yet another multi-factor authentication step with an additional capability around dynamic linking that links that transaction to the recipient and the amount that we provide with just one look in the camera. We're seeing here a burden to the issuers in particular who have the obligation to perform that strong customer authentication. So the banks that we are banking with, they need to fulfill this requirement. And ultimately, there is an account recovery process in case you lose all your devices or you upgrade your phone, which typically happens every 18 months, where we may have a second token app, a Google Authenticator, or similar that is lost with that device upgrade, or if you don't have our device at hand. And this process around the self-service recovery, where we don't have to walk into a branch to link a new device to our account, where we don't have to call a call center and redo the whole identity proofing or KYC process, is something that we help address by offering a portable biometric that enables you to recover access to your account from any new device. And we believe biometric offers a great method to addressing these use cases. It provides a lot of benefits, specifically around the user experience. That's something that everyone knows how to do, present the face or put a fingerprint on a sensor. It's frictionless. There's nothing you need to remember. It provides strong assurance that the user is actually the individual who is logging in or performing an action, because the biometric capability or a biometric is unique to one individual. And it's applicable anywhere and to anyone. Everyone knows how to deal with biometrics. They cannot be reused or shared because they are unique to the individual, and the account owner has, needs to be willing to perform an operation for this to happen. And it offers lower operational costs because there are no passwords involved if done truly passwordless with biometrics. So the additional support costs, the resets, but also the deployment in itself is something that is quite easy to do and to maintain. However, there are fundamental limitations or challenges with biometric authentication methods that exist. First and foremost, the privacy aspects of dealing with biometrics, which is something that we read about on a weekly basis in the news. And we can broadly categorize the market in two distinct fields. One that addresses that privacy issue, but that comes with additional challenges, which are local biometric technologies. Think of Apple's Face ID or Touch ID systems, or Windows Hello for Business in the Microsoft context, which are local biometric sensors that unlock the device that we are using, rather than really authenticate or identify the end user who is using that device. In addition, the solution is linked to that one device where our biometric template is stored. So if you don't have our device at hand, we cannot use a second device and authenticate on that device without having to re-enroll our biometric fingerprint on that new device. So it doesn't offer a portability and hence a link to the actual user who's using that device. On the other side, there is a way to address this and solve this and make it interoperable across devices. But in order for this to work, you would need to perform the biometric matching not on the device, but at some central location where this data has to be stored. And introducing a central honeypot of biometric data or very sensitive personal information is something that results in a high risk and in having to protect or secure biometric data of your employees or end users, which is something that many companies do not want to adopt, and hence we're seeing this vast adoption of the local biometric authentication technologies. But there is a solution to combine the best of both, to offer an interoperable biometric factor that is fundamentally secure and private. And what we do with Keyless is combining cryptographic techniques with biometric authentication methods to create or generate a unique cryptographic identifier from the user's biometric or their face when looking into the camera that is used once and then disappears again. So here's nothing that is sensitive that we store on the user's device, but also in no central database. But whenever the user performs an authentication, so for example, wants to log into a website, what happens is the user clicks on a login button. For example, when using a mobile device, receives a push notification in your application on the phone, presents the face. In the first step, we verify that the user is using a device that is linked to the account. So we have a possession factor involved transparently in the background. We capture the biometric, we split it in pieces, and we irreversibly encrypt these pieces. And this happens on the device. So this transformation takes the biometric and transforms it into opaque, irreversibly encrypted objects that are then an input into a cryptographic protocol that, without ever decrypting the data, are matching these pieces. And the result of this whole process is not just a binary yes or no. So think of Tobias using his device and presenting a fresh face into the camera. Yes, it's him. But the servers return an encrypted piece of Tobias's private key back to the device that he can decrypt, assemble together, use once, and then it disappears again. And every time Tobias authenticates, we're going through this process or generating the key or the password that is used once and then disappears, which offers that not just privacy compliant, but truly privacy preserving capability, interoperable across devices with a multi-factor secure approach, but just one look into the camera. And this is completely independent to the underlying hardware of the device, the operating system that it's running on. The only requirement is a basic camera that the device needs to have. So if we come back to the trade-off we described initially around friction fraud, the cost and compliance aspects, Keyless offers a seamless experience where the user has nothing to remember. It's one look in the camera, and you can do this across any device you want to use. So an iPhone 6 without the Face ID capability, an Android device from Samsung, from Huawei, a Windows desktop, completely interoperable. A corporate device, your personal device, any device with a camera. There's nothing to steal. There is no password or PIN involved, and there's no database that holds people's faces. So if an attacker wanted to get hold of the user's account, you always need the fresh user's face in addition to the device to perform an authentication. So that there's a high assurance and security from or against account takeover fraud, from credential reuse, SIM swapping, phishing, because we guarantee that the user is the genuine person who wants to access that account. In addition, we guarantee rapid time to value, both in terms of setup and maintenance, passwordless capability that helps mitigate the password-related support center costs around resets, and offers a frictionless way to deploy across the enterprise. And lastly, we guarantee strong compliance to regulations such as the GDPR or PSD2 requirements around authentication, where we offer not just a compliant but fundamentally privacy-preserving capability without storing biometric data, and not just that, but without processing personal identifiable information. So it's a truly anonymous biometric matching, where we can guarantee that it is the same user who is accessing that account, but Keyless or our customers have no mathematically or cryptographically provably no way and no possibility to get access or hold of that user information. So when we talk about some real life use cases where we help customers, and here predominantly in the banking or financial services space, in this example with a very large European bank who suffered a lot of fraud or account takeover fraud and resulting losses based on social engineering or SIM swapping, and particularly from users who pretended to have lost all their devices and recovered access to the account. So they're leveraging the Keyless SDK as part of their banking application, and in particular that portable identity or recovery feature that allows their users to reset access to their account fully self-serve without having to call the call center or the support agents, and that offers a frictionless way to help address that very use case. In addition to that, we're working with that same bank, but also another large bank in Switzerland on the payments use case, so transaction signing, authorizing payments in the checkout process, and facilitating that multi-factor authentication or strong customer authentication process with just one look in the camera. In doing so across their entire user base in all devices that these users are using, in increasing the security of that, but first and foremost in improving that user experience without having a PIN code that you need to copy and paste, without having a second token application that you need to use, but within that banking application, when you check out, you just remain in the app, you present your face, and the payment is authorized, and the dynamic linking capability is fulfilled in the back. Another example, and the last example for today, a neobank, so a modern bank who's using Keyless to reduce support center or call center cost. And as initially mentioned, simple reset can cost up to $70 in the enterprise. Typically about 20 to up to 50% of the entire call center operation is linked to password-related issues. So account resets, forgotten and lost passwords. So it is not just a user experience aspect, but also one that can help reduce operational costs in maintaining the access to user accounts. And with that, I pass it back to Tobias. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Extremely insightful. I love that. I love the transportability of Keyless the most, because as you said, there just is no biometric factor today that you can transfer between devices. And I think that's extremely, extremely powerful. And what I brought here is just a few stats. We did a survey on what do users actually want. And if we just look at it here, we see that exactly this passwordless, biometrics, MFA, this is what users actually expect nowadays. So when we talk about identity strategies as a whole with our customers, oftentimes they're saying, well, my audience just isn't ready for all of those factors yet. They wouldn't understand on why my application wants to scan their face, for example, or why they have to do more than one factor. And what we're seeing is the exact opposite. Half of all users that we surveyed would even sign up just by knowing that their data would be more secure, which, if you think about it, makes a lot of sense, because that means whoever they sign up to are willing to invest into keeping that user's data more secure. And in the end, this is what a user does. They trade some information about getting back a service. So if they know they can trust that their data will be handled securely and that there are checks in place so they don't suffer from account takeover, SIM swaps, whatever attacks we may come up in the future, they are a lot more willing to give you all of their personal data, knowing that you will protect them. And on the other hand, for you as application developers, some of you may thinking, well, yes, but MFA is catching on and there are so many solutions out there. Now is the best time to invest into those technologies. What we're seeing is, yes, technologies like single sign-on, they are common now. Being able to sign into multiple apps with one ID, though common is still defined as half of all applications, but at least it's a bit more adopted. But when we come into this biometric login, even passwordless login, even any multi-factor authentication to start with that, we see not even a third of all companies have adopted that yet. And when it comes to biometrics and passwordless authentication, just every fifth company has adopted that. So if you adopt this technology, you are 1 out of 5. There are 4 competitors who cannot compare that level of trust and security that you are offering your customers. And depending on your industry, this could be even more significant. So what we see is that this is not a hygiene factor. This is not something which is just part of a toolbox. Using keyless technology, using that biometric passwordless authentication is a business differentiator, which can create value for you. And not only another tool in a tool chain. When we think about unlocking that value, though, and this is something that we're seeing and we feel is very important to share, it's always about thinking, how can we make sure that we get that right identity assurance with limiting user friction? Fabian told about it or talked about it before. Usually when we try to increase assurance, when we try to increase security, we increase friction as well. So we're putting in new intrusive authentication methods, which just make it harder for users to access our applications. And we're looking for that sweet spot. And the capability that or the problem that we can solve with a technology like the one of keyless is that in a traditional identity world, we would have a very hard time thinking about how to make sure that users are secure without any friction. So if we look at an e-commerce website, traditionally users sign up with email and password, which is a friction because they have to remember a password, they have to potentially reset it, which is frustrating for the user and expensive for the company, which creates a lot of traffic. So we want to get rid of that. Our only options are social federations or a traditional passwordless using email or SMS. The problem of social identities is we don't own the identity. We're always dependent on a third-party service. You are not operating on your own. It decreases your privacy because suddenly you let a third party know of when your users are accessing your application, and we get limited information back. Plus, we have to trust that that social identity provider has actually verified the user first. When we go to traditional passwordless, like SMS and email, there are dozens of very well-documented attacks of how a hacker could hijack that account, could hijack that authentication method and take over an account. So it's not really that secure, though it's super convenient to just get an SMS and type in a one-time code. So we would have to default to step up MFA a lot of times. And we would have to make sure that our users are really, really secure, which is intrusive, which brings in friction, which is just overly annoying. And this is where we can bridge the gap with keyless, where instead of relying only on email username password or falling back to more insecure methods, we can just go to this modern passwordless approach. We can go to that biometric approach, and we can say by default, you already have an extremely high identity assurance without creating friction. We can link those together. A user can still use an email, a username, and password if that makes them feel more comfortable. But they also have the choice to use the less frictionless, but at least a secure way of authenticating to access your app, which means for you, you have to fall back to the intrusive other MFA factors a lot less. You already have everything you need and the assurance you need from that biometric check in the beginning. You don't have to nag your users, and nagging in that case translates directly into your bottom line, because that means users are more likely to come back, they're more likely to share data with you, and they're more likely to recommend you to their friends or their colleagues to say, this is a really good solution and it makes my life really easy, not only in the value it creates, but also in the way I can access it. To wrap everything up though, when we think about identity and access management as a whole, there are a lot of moving parts in it. There are form factors which are getting added. So the last big wave was smartwatches. Before that, we have mobile phones. Before that, we had websites. Now we're talking about metaverses and VR. So form factors are always changing, and the way and the capabilities that users have available to authenticate themselves is always changing. So we have to adapt to that. We have to adapt to more regulations, because with more technical capabilities, we also need more regulations to make sure no one's abusing those new possibilities that we have. And more services are becoming digital. While probably not a lot of people 20 years ago have used car sharing, it's now a very common thing in major cities. Same as ordering from restaurants and so many other use cases. And there's only more services that will be digitalized in the future, which comes with new identity with new authentication requirements. And this is where Keyless as well as Auth0 can help you staying on top of the curve and not use time, customers, and sleep over keeping up with all those changes, but unblocking you to keep innovating, to keep bringing the best services out there to your customers, and just leaving identity to us where we can take care for you. That being said, thank you ever so much for your attendance. I hope you learned something. I hope you got a few more interesting ideas on how to shape your own identity journey and how to proceed with your identity life. And of course, we would hope to, or we would love to support you in that. If you have any questions, if you want to dive deeper into your own personal scenarios, feel free to reach out to Fabian or myself, or feel free to ask some questions if you have any. So we can move to the Q&A part. And let me just stop my screen sharing so I can see all of your questions a bit better. We actually got a few in already. First one, I think this goes to you, Fabian. Is Keyless considering other biometrics besides face, such as voice, for example?
Yes, very good question. In short, yes, we are. We're not considering another physical biometric like fingerprint, because we want to make it the most interoperable biometric capability across devices that any user can use, which is not the case with fingerprint, because especially most modern devices do not have a fingerprint sensor embedded. However, we are working on behavioral biometrics, so user interaction with how you use your device, whether that's how you move your phone, how you swipe on the screen, as an added passive biometric factor. And this is something that we aim to introduce later this year. So this is the additional capability in the biometric space that we're adding.
All right, awesome. There is a lot of interest in the Keyless service, so we got like 5 to 6 more questions for you in, so
Great.
Be ready. Is Keyless only, I think I can even answer that, but is Keyless only offered on mobile devices, or does it support desktop too? I remember you said desktop is supported as well, right? Like a Windows device.
Yes, so we offer both a mobile and desktop SDK, so it's usable across mobile and desktop devices. And that is native across platforms, Android, iOS, or Windows. And yes, it's essentially not dependent on the underlying device itself or the hardware requirements that we would have, but we would need a camera that the device or an external webcam with a desktop, for example, would offer.
Okay. And I think as a follow-up to that, so just to be very clear, Keyless lets me deliver MFA on just a mobile, and Face ID couldn't do that. Or probably to rephrase it, you can also deliver that experience where Face ID wouldn't be available on mobile devices, for example.
In short, yes. You could think of Keyless as a multi-factor Face ID on any device that has a camera, in short. So we don't require, I think iOS, which version it was, iPhone 7 onwards that has the Face ID. It could be a device, or iPhone 8, so it could be an iPhone 6 or 7. It could be any Android device from whatever manufacturer. Yeah, we don't, but it works as well on the latest iPhones as well. So in simple terms, Face ID, but true multi-factor Face ID, device agnostic.
Okay. No, that sounds amazing. I think that also answers the next question we had. Why should I use Keyless over Face ID when Face ID is available?
Yes, so when Face ID is available, so thinking all of your users have one of the latest iPhones. So living in that world, Keyless is different in the sense that it is a biometric that is not bound to the device. So what Face ID does is that it unlocks access to your phone or the app that you're using, but it doesn't really authenticate yourself. I think you could enroll anyone's face, your partner's, your family, friends' faces onto your phone, It would unlock the phone just as well as your face would do. The iPhone doesn't know who you are, but it unlocks that access, but it doesn't guarantee that strong link to the actual account holder's identity and the very person who should be accessing the service. And that is the difference. So genuine identity assurance versus device protection. That is what we offer. And Face ID is one. If you just use Face ID, you're using a one-factor biometric. With Keyless, we're also verifying the identity of the device. In addition to that, for the user, it would look and feel the same, though.
Okay. No, that makes perfect sense. Thank you for that. And while we are at multiple people using the same phone, another hopefully theoretical question. If I wanted to give my little brother a fake ID so he can buy me a beer, can I set up an account but use his face at the first stage so in future he can pretend to be me?
Yeah, very good question. And it's a very important question around user enrollment and registration. And there are two scenarios. One where you would have an unsupervised enrollment, where indeed you just have an identifier like an email address and you associate that account with one face. What we guarantee is that it can only be that one face or the evolution of that face with that user account that is being used. But if you wanted to prevent, and that could be useful if you have a supervised enrollment process with an agent who controls it, if you're in an enterprise or workplace setting, where you give devices to your users and you know that that user is using that particular email address, for example, and you have an identity proofing step initiated through that way. For the digital onboarding or remote onboarding, what we offer is an integrated identity proofing step or flow where we would check against a government issued identity document to ensure that that user or your son in that case would be over the age of 18 or 16, depending on where you are, to having a beer or buying a beer. And yeah, that would be embedded as a native flow, but we offer both, either with or without an identity proofing step.
That's great. And I think it's very important to have also that concept of which level of assurance do I need in what place. So my face doesn't prove my age, so I need something to prove my age. And then if those two are linked together, only then I can sign in. And then, yeah, you're getting a lot more flexibility. But we have another attempt to break the system. What if twins would use your service? Like identical twins, I assume.
Yeah, very good question. So first of all, Keyless requires the device that is linked to the account in addition to the face. So it would need to be a twin. That twin or identical twin would also have to have access to that very device that the sibling or the other twin would be using. Given that scenario, it comes back to biometric accuracy and the question of the performance of the biometric authentication. What we've done here is several assessments, both internally through labs or independent organizations. One of which, for example, the FIDO Alliance, not to mention because that is important to us for a particular reason, who certified Keyless as a biometric vendor. I think the accuracy parameters are 0.01% false accept rate, less than 3% false reject rate. We are orders of magnitude within these thresholds. I think it's 7 companies, Alibaba, Samsung, and a few others with that certification. In addition to that, there's a certification, the FIDO2 certification that we've received, which is important because essentially FIDO as one of describe the industry bodies for passwordless biometric authentication in the enterprise aspect, assessed the Keyless technology and essentially says that yes, we are not storing biometric in any central location. That is, they're very much proponents for local authentication for the very reason that biometric data should not or cannot leave the device, which is not the case with Keyless. We're helping them address some of the inherent issues with local biometrics, and particularly account recovery, where the local authentication technology just cannot have a solution. Coming back to the question is, yes, so twins are a challenge for biometric authentication. But from what we've seen and the tests we've and others conducted is that our technology proves to work very well.
That is great to hear. And you also answered another question that we still had. Is keyless FIDO2 certified? Yes, it is.
Correct.
Perfect. Then, very last question, at least for now. If I did defeat your encryption on one database shard of my facial image, could that element be used to search for my image on the web and identify me?
In short, no, that is not possible. With keyless, you cannot get the information whether a particular user is part of that database. It is cryptographically impossible. Could be if you're using a hashing function, I think you could brute force that, and I'm not the cryptographic expert, but what we're using is way more complex than that. It's multi-party computation, secret sharing, and zero knowledge proofs in combination. But yeah, what we can say and what we know is that the user is using a device that is trusted without knowing anything about the device or the identity, but we know it is a device that the user has linked to the account. We're proving, say, device health, whether it's jailbroken and things like that. In addition, and distinct from that, the user's face or the biometric information, but we have no capability to check whether a face exists in the database. But it's a one-to-one match that we perform.
All right. Awesome. That's very good. Good. It seems like these were all the questions we got. So thank you again for taking the time, sticking with us. We hope you learned something new today. And if you have any questions or want to follow up, please feel free to reach out to Fabian and myself. I'm more than happy to support you. With that, enjoy the rest of your day and speak to you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.